She said she came because of the storm. But the storm wasn't the reason. My name is Caleb and I'm 32. And for 3 years I've come home to a house where nobody's waiting. That July night, Olivia knocked on my door with rain in her hair and a laptop under her arm, and I let her in without thinking twice. By the time the rain stopped, she was asleep on my lap, and I was staring at a message on her screen she never meant for me to see. 14 words that rewrote everything I thought I knew about that night. I fix houses for a living. The kind of work that keeps your hands busy and your head quieter than it'd be otherwise. Most mornings I'm up before 6, loading tools into the truck, driving to someone else's problem while the coffee's still burning a hole in my stomach. I hang doors, patch drywall, rewire kitchen outlets that some homeowner tried to fix themselves with a YouTube video and a prayer. It pays enough, and it keeps me moving. And every evening, I drive back to my own place, a small clapboard house on the edge of town with a porch that sags in the middle and a kitchen faucet that drips when the wind blows hard from the north. I've been meaning to fix that faucet for 2 years now. The washer's probably shot 10-minute job if I just get under the sink and do it. But there's something about fixing your own place that's harder than fixing someone else's. When it's your house, the broken things blend into the background until you stop seeing them entirely. 3 years ago, a woman named Beth told me I was too hard to reach. She said it gentle, the way you'd tell someone their coat has a rip they haven't noticed. She wasn't angry, just tired of knocking on a door that never seemed to open from the inside. I didn't argue with her because she wasn't wrong. I built a life that didn't require anyone else in it, and somewhere along the way I'd also built it so nobody could get in, even if they tried. After Beth left, the quiet got bigger. Not louder, just wider, like a room where you can hear the fridge humming from the kitchen, because there's nothing else competing for the space. The phone stopped ringing after 9. The second coffee mug I never washed gathered dust on the shelf. The chair across from mine at the kitchen table stayed empty so long I started using it to hold my work gloves. I'm not telling you this, so you'll feel sorry for me. I chose this, or at least I chose the things that led to it. And most days the quiet doesn't feel like loneliness so much as it feels like the weather. It's just what the day brings. You put on your boots and you walk out into it. That July, the heat had been sitting on the whole county for a week, like a wet blanket someone forgot to take off. The kind of heat that makes the air thick and the sky hazy and the asphalt soft enough to leave marks when you walk across the church parking lot in sneakers. By late afternoon, the clouds would pile up in the west, tall and dark and slow-moving, the way they do when the atmosphere is storing something up it hasn't decided to release yet. I'd been watching those clouds from the porch for 3 evenings straight, beer in one hand, the other hand resting on the arm of the chair my father built back when he still had the strength for that kind of work. The weather guys on the radio kept saying the storms would pass south of us, but the air didn't feel like storms passing south. The air felt like something gathering. That evening, I was out on the porch when the sky went sideways. The clouds hadn't passed south at all. They'd been building right over the valley, stacking on top of each other until the whole western horizon turned the color of a bruise. The wind shifted, and the temperature dropped about 10 degrees in the time it takes to walk from the porch to the front door, which is when I knew the storm wasn't going to miss us. I went inside to close the windows, the ones I'd left open, because the house gets stale in July if you don't let the air move through. The first drops hit the roof while I was cranking the one over the kitchen sink. Big, heavy drops that sound like someone throwing gravel. Then the sky opened up and the rain came down so hard I couldn't see the mailbox from the front window. I stood in the hallway watching it come down, when the knock came, barely loud enough to hear over the rain, which is probably why it took me a second to realize someone was at the door. I opened it, and Olivia Brennan stood on my porch looking like she'd walked here through a car wash. Her hair plastered to her face in dark wet streaks, and her clothes soaked through. But she had her laptop bag clutched against her chest like she'd been protecting it the whole way. She wore a knit sweater, cream-colored, the kind you throw on when the AC is too cold at the library, and it had soaked up so much rain it was clinging to her in a way that made her look smaller than she probably was. She's 26, and she works at the county library downtown, the one next to the hardware store where I buy paneling. I knew her face the way, faces in a small town. We talked a few times. Once at the checkout counter when she was reshelving books and I was picking up a hold. Another time at the gas station when she dropped her coffee and I handed it back to her. Small transactions that don't mean anything except that two people exist in the same place. "To Caleb," she said, and her voice shook a little, either from the cold or from the walk, or from standing on a man's porch at 7 in the evening in a storm she hadn't planned for. My car wouldn't start in the parking lot. The power's out of my apartment, and I didn't want to sit there alone in the dark. "I'm sorry. I know this is out of nowhere." She was already half turning like she was going to leave, like the apology had been the whole visit, and now she'd take up no more of my time. I've seen that move before, the instinct to pull back when you're afraid you've asked for too much just by showing up. "Come inside," I said, not a question, not an invitation I had to think about. Just 2 words. The way you'd say them if someone was standing in the rain and you had a dry room. She stepped in and I took her laptop bag because her hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. I grabbed the towel from the bathroom and handed it to her, and she stood in my hallway, drying her hair while I went to hang her wet jacket on the hook by the door. The house felt different already. Not warmer, exactly, but less empty. The kind of difference you notice the way you notice a light come on in a window across the street. Something's changed, but you can't say what yet. I made tea because I didn't know what else to do with a guest. It's what my mother would have done, and she raised me in a house where offering someone a drink was the first thing and asking them what was wrong was the second. The kettle took longer than usual because the gas flame was low and I hadn't gotten around to fixing the regulator, which is another one of those things in my own house I keep not fixing. Olivia sat at the kitchen table and looked around while I waited for the water, the way people do when they're seeing a man's life for the first time, checking the corners, noticing what's on the counters and what isn't. My kitchen is clean but sparse. A knife block, a coffee maker, a jar of nails. I keep meaning to sort. The kind of kitchen that tells you a man lives alone, but at least he wipes the counters down. She wrapped both hands around the mug when I set it in front of her, the steam rising up around her face in a soft cloud, and she already looked warmer. Less like someone who'd been caught in a storm, and more like someone who'd chosen to be exactly where she was. "Your house is nice," she said, which was kind, because my house is fine, but it's not nice. It's sturdy the way a work boot is sturdy. It does the job without calling attention to itself. "It keeps the rain out," I said, and she laughed. A real laugh that started in her chest and came out before she could catch it. Not polite and not performative. The kind that fills up a kitchen for a second and then fades into something warmer. We talked about small things. First, the way strangers do when they're figuring out whether the silence between them is comfortable or not. She asked about the tools on the counter, and I told her I was building a bookshelf. Had been for 6 months. She asked why it wasn't finished, and I told her nobody was waiting for it, so the hurry never found me. "That's sad," she said, but she didn't say it like she was pitying me. She said it like she recognized the shape of it. "What about you?" I said. "You read a lot, I'm guessing, working at the library." "I read the first chapter of every book that comes in," she said. "I can't help it, even the bad ones. I keep thinking the first chapter might surprise me." "What kind of stories do you like?" She thought about it for a second, and something in her expression changed, got a little more honest. "The quiet ones," she said, "where nothing big happens but everything changes anyway." I didn't know it then, but she was describing the kind of night we were about to have. The rain was louder now, hammering the roof in waves that rose and fell like breathing thunder rolled somewhere close, and she flinched. Not a big flinch, just her shoulders pulling in and her fingers tightening around the mug. I didn't say anything about it. I just pushed the mug a little closer to her hands and sat back down. The conversation came easier after that, the way it does when two people realize the silence between them isn't something they need to fix. She told me about her sister in Columbus, how they talked every day, how her sister worried about her living alone in a town this small. She told me about the reading group she ran on Thursday nights, and the old man who came every week just to argue about the endings. I told her about my crew at work, about the client who'd spent 40 minutes deciding between warm beige and sand beige for her bathroom walls, and she laughed again, and the sound of it sat in the kitchen like it belonged there. The lights flickered twice around 9 o'clock, and she looked up at the ceiling like she was waiting for something to decide. The third time they went out and stayed out, and the kitchen dropped into a darkness that felt heavier than it should have, the way a room feels when the electricity leaves, and you realize how much of the space those bulbs were holding. I got up without thinking and walked to the hallway closet where I keep the emergency lantern, the one my father bought after the ice storm in 2008 knocked our power out for 4 days. I found it by feel, same shelf, same spot, and when I clicked it on the yellow light spread across the kitchen in a way that made the room look like a different place entirely. I grabbed candles from the drawer. My mother always kept them in, the one by the stove with the matches and the birthday candles and the flashlight that hasn't worked since I don't know when. I set 2 on the table and 1 on the counter, and the kitchen became smaller and warmer, like a space that had always been too big for one person and was finally the right size. Olivia pulled her knees up onto the chair and wrapped her arms around them, and for a minute, she was quiet. The rain hammered the roof, and the wind pushed against the windows, and the candlelight made her face softer, younger, less like someone who worked at a library, and more like someone the storm had carried in. "I don't like storms alone," she said, not asking for anything. Not complaining, just telling me the way you tell someone something when the dark makes it easier to be honest than the light does. I sat back down across from her. The table between us, and the candle between us too, its flame bending every time the wind found a crack somewhere. I could hear her breathing, and the rain, and the creak of the house settling against the weather, and I thought about how long it had been since I'd heard another person breathe in my kitchen. "Do you get lonely out here?" she asked. I could have lied. I could have made a joke about the quiet being peaceful, which is what I usually say when someone asks. But the candlelight and the rain, and the way she'd said alone, like she understood exactly what it meant, made the lie feel heavier than the truth. "Yeah," I said. "Most nights," she nodded. Not with pity, with recognition. The way you nod when someone tells you something you already knew about them because you've been carrying the same thing yourself. The rain shifted then, going from a hammering to a steady tapping, like the storm had said what it needed to say and was settling into something that would last. The kitchen felt different, with the candles lit and her across the table, smaller and not cramped, but held, like a space that had been waiting a long time for someone to fill it. I noticed then that she'd set her laptop on the counter, by the door still open, the screen casting a faint light toward the hallway. She'd been typing on it earlier, before the power went out, her fingers moving, and then pausing the way a person does when they're writing something they can't quite commit to sending. I didn't think about it at the time. It was just another thing in the room, the way a clock is. Just another thing until it stops. "We should move to the living room," I said. Kitchen chairs weren't made for waiting out a storm. The living room was darker than the kitchen, because the windows are bigger, and the rain pressed against them like something trying to get in. I put another log in the fireplace, the one I rarely use because it's easier to flip a switch than build a fire, but the power was out and the night was going to be long enough to need one. The couch is old but good, the sort that holds you when you sit down and doesn't let go until you make yourself get up. My grandmother's, originally covered in a brown fabric that's worn soft, in the places where people have been sitting for 30 years. Olivia settled into one end and I took the other, and the space between us was about the length of a man's arm, which felt like exactly the right amount of distance, and also like too much. She'd brought her laptop from the kitchen and set it on the coffee table. The screen still bright against the dim room, and the battery was holding fine. She had a messaging app open and was typing something, her fingers moving quick and then stopping, like she was writing something she kept second-guessing. I wasn't paying attention to the words on that screen, just watching the fire catch, the way the flames curl around the edges of a log before they decide to commit. She told me more about her sister, whose name was Hannah, and how Hannah had moved to Columbus after college and married a guy who worked in insurance and had a dog that couldn't stop chasing its own tail. She told me how Hannah called her every Sunday night and asked if she was seeing anyone, and how Olivia always said no and changed the subject. "What do you say when she asks?" I said. "I say, 'I'm fine,'" Olivia said. Which is true most of the time. Then the thunder cracked, closer than it had been all night, loud enough to rattle the windows and shake the log in the fireplace. She flinched hard, harder than before, and this time she didn't just pull her shoulders in. She shifted toward me on the couch, closing the distance between us without seeming to decide to do it. Her shoulder pressed against my arm, and she stayed there, breathing fast, her eyes on the window. I went, still not pulling away and not moving closer, just frozen the way I get when I'm aware of every inch of space between my body and someone else's, when the air itself feels like it has a weight and a temperature and a direction. She didn't move back. She kept talking, telling me about the reading group again, about the book they'd argued over last Thursday, but her voice was softer now, closer to a murmur, and the words mattered less than the sound of them. Her head drifted toward my shoulder, and I felt the weight of it settle there. Light, but real, the way something you've been waiting for feels when it finally arrives, without warning. Then she drifted lower, her head sliding from my shoulder to my chest, and then lower still, until her cheek was resting against my leg, and her breathing had slowed to something steady and even. She was falling asleep on my couch, in the middle of a storm, with her head on my leg, like it was the most natural place in the world to be. I didn't put my arm around her. My hands stayed on my knees, fingers curled loosely, holding the moment the way you hold something fragile that you're afraid to grip too hard because it might break, or you might wake up and find out it wasn't real. The fire crackled. The rain tapped the roof. Her breathing was slow and warm against my leg, and I sat there in the half-dark, thinking about how long it had been since someone got close enough that I could feel them breathe. Olivia's breathing changed around midnight. It went from the shallow breathing of someone fighting sleep to the deep, slow rhythm of someone who'd given in entirely. Her whole weight shifted against me, her head settling fully onto my thigh, her laptop still clutched loosely in one hand, the screen tilted slightly toward the ceiling. I didn't move. Hadn't moved in what felt like an hour. My left leg was numb from the knee down, that pins and needles feeling that starts in your foot and works its way up. And I would have given a lot to shift my weight, but I'd have given more to let her keep sleeping. A man who's been alone for 3 years doesn't move when someone finally gets close enough to use him as a pillow. The rain had slowed to a steady tap by then, no longer the violent hammering from earlier, but a gentler rhythm, like the storm had worn itself out and was just going through the motions now. The fire had burned down to embers orange and low, throwing just enough light to see the shape of her against my leg. I watched her the way you watch something you're afraid to disturb, not studying her, just noticing. The way her hair had dried in uneven waves from the rain, the knit sweater pulled tight across her shoulders, still a little damp in the thicker parts. The way her fingers were still curled around the edge of the laptop like she'd forgotten she was holding it. The small movements her face made in her sleep, the kind that looked like someone is having a conversation you can't hear. I thought about the last time someone had been this close to me, and I couldn't pin it down. It wasn't Beth. By the end, we'd been sleeping on opposite sides of a bed that felt wider than any bed should. It might have been my dog, the one that died 2 winters ago, the mutt my sister talked me into adopting, and that ended up being the only thing in the house that was glad to see me come home. He used to sleep across my feet on cold nights, and I'd lie there not moving because the weight of him felt like the only thing keeping me anchored to the floor. This was different. This was a woman I barely knew who'd shown up at my door in a storm and was now asleep on my lap like she'd been doing it for years, and the weight of her was doing something to my chest that I couldn't name and wasn't sure I wanted to. The laptop screen had dimmed while she slept, going into that low-power state where the backlight drops, but the display doesn't shut off entirely. I could see the glow of it on the coffee table, a soft blue-white light in a room that was mostly embers and shadow. I'd noticed it earlier when she was still awake and typing, but I hadn't thought about it since. Now, with nothing else to look at, and the quiet pressing in from every direction, I found my eyes drifting toward that glow. The fire crackled once, a small sound that barely registered, and I became aware of the laptop screen again. It was still on, the messaging app still open, and somewhere in the time I'd been sitting there not moving, the screen had brightened. Maybe a notification had come through, or maybe the screensaver had cycled off, or maybe the laptop had just decided to wake up on its own the way electronics sometimes do. The light from the screen caught my eye, and I looked down at it, not meaning to read anything, just noticing that it was on. And then the words were there, bright against the dark room, printed on a screen that was angled just enough toward my face that I couldn't have avoided them if I'd tried. A draft message addressed to her sister Hannah, never sent. I didn't mean to read it. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't curiosity, and it wasn't snooping. The words were right there in the glow of the screen, and my eyes found them before my conscience could catch up and look away. By the time I understood what I was looking at, the words were already in my head, and I couldn't unsee them anymore. Then you can unhear a sound. I only came over because I wanted him to hold me. 14 words, not a confession of love or some grand declaration that would belong in a movie. Just a young woman telling her sister the truth she couldn't say out loud, the real reason she knocked on my door instead of waiting out the storm in her car or walking to the diner 3 blocks away that stays open no matter what. I read it again, then a third time. Each time the words meant something different, like a photograph that changes depending on the angle you hold it at. The first time through, it was surprise. The second time, it was disbelief, the kind that makes you question whether you read it right, whether the words actually say what you think they say. The third time, it was recognition, the kind that hits you square in the chest and makes you forget how to breathe for a second because suddenly everything you assumed about the last 5 hours is wrong. All those small moments from the evening rearranged themselves in my head, clicking into place like tumblers in a lock I didn't know I'd been trying to open, her showing up here instead of calling a friend with a working generator. The way she'd said, "I don't like storms alone," and her voice had dipped on the word alone, like she was saying something heavier than the words themselves. The way she'd leaned into me on the couch, like she'd been waiting for permission, and the thunder had finally given it to her. She hadn't come for shelter from the rain, she'd come for shelter from the same thing I've been living in. For 3 years. The quiet and the empty chair, and the nights where the only sound is a refrigerator and your own breathing. She'd come for me, and she couldn't say it to my face, so she'd typed it to her sister instead, and then she'd fallen asleep before she could send it or delete it, and now it was sitting there on a screen, glowing between us like a truth neither of us was supposed to touch. I stared at those 14 words, and my chest did something it hadn't done in longer than I could remember. It opened. Not wide, not all the way, but enough to let something in that had been pressing against the outside for a long time. But now I had a different problem, and it was the kind that doesn't come with instructions. What do you do with a truth you were never supposed to see from a woman who's asleep on your lap and doesn't know you've seen it? Says, I could have closed the laptop, which would have been the right thing, probably. The decent thing, because she'd written those words for her sister and not for me, and reading them was already a violation of something she hadn't offered. Closing it would have been putting the moment back where it belonged, in the space between her and Hannah, where it was never supposed to cross into my sight. I considered it seriously, sitting there with her head on my leg and the truth glowing on the screen, thinking about what kind of man closes a laptop and pretends he never saw the thing that would have changed his whole evening if he'd let it. A good man, maybe a respectful one, a man who understands that some things aren't his to know, even when they're about him. But then I thought about the flinch when the thunder cracked. The way she'd said, I don't like storms alone, and how that sentence meant more than it sounded like it meant. The way she'd shifted toward me on the couch, like her body had made a decision her mouth hadn't caught up to yet. The way she'd fallen asleep on my lap, instead of on the other end of the couch where she'd started, She could have gone to the diner, could have called a coworker with a house that had power, could have sat in her car with the heater running until the storm passed. She chose my door. And she chose to tell her sister why, even if she couldn't tell me. My hand hovered over the laptop, my fingers twitching like they couldn't decide what they were supposed to do. I wanted to close it. I wanted to protect what she'd written, the way you'd protect something fragile that someone handed you by accident. But I also knew that if I closed it and said nothing and let her walk out tomorrow morning, thinking her secret was safe, I'd be choosing the same loneliness I've been living in for 3 years. The kind where the door stays closed and the chair stays empty and the quiet just keeps getting wider. The fire was almost out now. Just a few orange embers pulsing in the dark, the last heat of something that had been burning all evening. The rain had stopped, or nearly stopped. I could hear it dripping off the gutters in an uneven rhythm, the leftover sounds of a storm that had moved on. Somewhere outside, a bird was singing the way birds do when the weather breaks, like the world is starting over and they want to be the first ones to say so. I didn't close the laptop. I didn't touch it. I just sat there, with the weight of her against me and the words on that screen glowing in the dark, and I waited for morning. I waited for her to wake up. Because closing the laptop would be one kind of respect, but sitting with what I'd learned and not running from it was another kind, and I think it might have been the braver one. Morning came, in through the curtains, the way it does after a storm, gray and soft and clean, like the air had been washed overnight and hung out to dry. I'd been awake the whole time, sitting on that couch, with my back against the armrest and my dead left leg stretched out in front of me, watching the window shift from black to dark blue, to the pale color that means the sun is up somewhere behind the clouds. Olivia stirred around 6. I felt it before I saw it, the small change in her breathing, the way her weight shifted against my leg. She made a sound, not quite a word, the kind of sound a person makes when they're coming back from somewhere deep and the real world is still a few seconds away. Then she woke up the rest of the way and realized where she was. And the change in her body was immediate. She sat up fast, pulling away from my lap like she touched something hot, and her hand went to her hair and her face went red. "Oh, God," she said. "I fell asleep on you. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to just pass out like that. I was just so tired in the storm and I'm really sorry." She was talking fast, the way embarrassment makes you run your mouth to fill the gap between what you intended and what happened. But then she saw the laptop still open on the coffee table, and her face changed again, going from embarrassment to something sharper, something like alarm. She grabbed it and closed it fast, shoved it into her bag, and when she looked back at me, her cheeks were still burning and her eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. She thought I hadn't seen it, figured the screen had been faced away from me, or that I'd been too focused on the fire, or that the dark had been too thick for me to read anything. The relief on her face when she closed that laptop was the relief of someone who just dodged something, and watching her feel that relief was almost worse than the secret itself. "I should go," she said, already reaching for her jacket where it hung dry on the hook by the door. "Thank you so much for letting me wait out the storm. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." She was doing the thing again, the thing she'd done on the porch when she showed up, the half turn toward the door, the quick thank you, the apology for taking up space. Like, being here had been a burden she'd imposed, and now she was relieving me of it. I didn't stop her, but I said one thing before she could reach the jacket, quiet, and not a question, just a statement, the way my father used to say things when he'd already decided and just hadn't told you yet. "You could stay for coffee." She paused. Her hand was on the jacket, but she hadn't picked it up. She turned back toward me, standing in the doorway between the living room and the hall, and she looked at me. Really looked, not the quick glance of someone who's already leaving, but the longer kind. The kind that takes a second because you're seeing something you didn't expect to see. I don't know what my face was doing right then. I wasn't trying to communicate anything. I was just sitting on the couch with my dead leg and my tired eyes, and the morning light coming in through the window offering coffee because I didn't know how to offer anything bigger. But whatever she saw in my face, it made her hand drop from the jacket. She sat back down, slowly, in the spot where she'd started the night before. But this time, she wasn't pulling away. She was choosing to stay, not because the storm was keeping her since the storm was already over, and not because her power was out since it was probably back on by now, but because of something else we both knew, even if neither of us was saying it yet. We ended up on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, sitting in the wooden chairs my father built, watching the sky do that thing it does after a storm where it can't decide if it's done or not. The air smelled like rain and wet grass, and the particular sweetness of asphalt after a hot night of weather, the kind of morning that feels like the world took a bath. She was quiet for a while, both hands around her mug, looking out at the yard where the rain had beaten my vegetable patch flat, but the tomatoes were still hanging on. Then she set the mug on the arm of the chair and folded her hands in her lap, and I could see her gathering something, some piece of courage she'd been carrying. "Since she woke up, I need to tell you something," she said. I waited. The birds were loud that morning, filling the space where the thunder had been. "I didn't come over because my power was out," she said. I didn't look surprised. I wasn't. She noticed that, and something shifted in her expression. A quick calculation behind her eyes, like she was running through the possibilities of how I could already know. She looked at the coffee table inside, where her laptop had been. Then back at me. "Did you see it?" she asked. I nodded. Just once. Slow, not ashamed. Not proud either, just honest. The way you nod when there's no point pretending anymore. She covered her face with both hands and made a sound that was half laugh and half groan. The sound a person makes when the thing they were most afraid of happening has already happened, and now they have to figure out what comes next. The embarrassment was real and raw, written across her face in the way her ears had gone pink and her shoulders had pulled up toward her ears. But then she dropped her hands and looked at me, and I wasn't laughing, and I wasn't pitying her, and I wasn't uncomfortable. I was just sitting there, on the porch my father built, holding a mug of coffee, being present, the way I'd been all night. And she saw that, and something in her face changed from embarrassment to something quieter, something that looked a lot like relief. "I've noticed you for months," she said, and her voice was steady now, not shaking, not apologizing. "At the hardware store. At the farmer's market on Saturdays. You always look like you're carrying something heavy, but you never ask anyone to help you with it." I didn't know what to say. My hands were wrapped around the coffee mug so tight, my knuckles had gone white, like the mug was the only thing keeping me in the chair. I've been a man who fixes things his whole life, and there was nothing to fix here, nothing to adjust or tighten or replace. There was just the truth sitting on the porch between us, and me trying to figure out how to hold it without breaking it. "I've noticed you too," I said. She waited. The birds kept singing. The steam rose from both our mugs. "I just didn't think someone like you would notice someone like me," I said, and saying it out loud felt like taking a splinter out of my own hand. It had been in there so long, I'd stopped feeling it, and now that the words were out, the absence of it stung worse than the thing itself ever did. She shook her head not in disagreement, but in something closer to wonder, like she couldn't believe I'd been carrying that around and never let it show. "Caleb," she said, and then she stopped, and I think she was going to say something bigger, but instead she just said my name again, softer the second time, like the word itself was enough. I reached over and took her hand, not to pull her close or start something I wasn't ready for, just to hold it on the porch, in the morning light where the storm had brought her and something else had made her stay. Her fingers curled around mine, warm and certain, the way hands find each other when they've been waiting long enough. And we sat there on that porch, in the quiet after everything, 2 people who'd been living in the same small town, carrying the same kind of loneliness, too afraid to say what they meant until a storm forced the door open and a screen forced the truth out. The coffee got cold. Neither of us moved to warm it up. Sometimes the chair across from you doesn't need to stay empty. Sometimes a person walks through the rain and knocks on your door, and the storm is just the excuse they needed, and the real reason is the one they can only type in a draft they never send. We're still figuring it out. The bookshelf is still not finished. The faucet still drips when the wind comes from the north. But the chair across from mine, at the kitchen table, isn't holding work gloves anymore. If you want more spare room stories, subscribe. There's always another porch, another storm, another door someone's about to knock on.